What? No, but I have to look at my humorous little evolution things. I have those. You need that. No, this isn't the world according to Pat. This is the humus, what?
Are those on the internet?
No. No. They're just my secret little thing I'm sharing with you. My little ha-has, the things I do over my morning latte with my friends. It's exactly where these came from.
I love it. Are you going to show us just the more vulnerable side of yourself?
You think I have one? Yeah. Okay, so Capricorn, evolution, it's the law. Or climbing the evolutionary ladder. Aquarius, evolution is freaky. Or, what a long, strange trip it's been. And then there's another one, Aquarius, been there, done that. Pisces, disillusioned with evolution. Or, splash of water in the face, oh, this is evolution. Okay, so moving into Capricorn, I want to start with another reading from Rainer Maria Rilke, wonderful poet. Oh, I don't know if I brought, thanks. Thank you. This is for Capricorn, and to me it's a comment on conditioning, and I'll talk about it a little bit. Sometimes a man stands up during dinner and walks outside and keeps on walking because of a church that stands somewhere in the east, and his children say blessings on him as if he were dead. And another man who remains inside his own house dies there, inside the dishes and the glasses, so that his children have to go far out into the world toward that same church which he forgot. So I'm not sure what Rilke was thinking when he wrote that, but to me, it talks about these two levels of familial and specifically father kind of conditioning, that the father who goes out in the world, as he's saying, or let's say that the actualized father who fulfills his own potential, leaves the home and his children say blessings on him as if he were dead, in a way basically leaving them to live their lives, albeit fatherless. The man who stays home and doesn't pursue this calling to the church in the East, the inheritance that the children carry, the psychic inheritance, is that they then have to go do that, right? And Jung talked about this. Jung talked about the unfulfilled potentials of the ancestors, and it's the same, and I could talk about just about that in the Capricorn archetype, but I won't, because it's another form of work that I do, is working with the ancestral spirits. And it's also the unresolved issues, the unhealed traumas of the ancestors that continue to stay within the family line and haunt the current generations. So we have not only on that, etheric level, that kind of conditioning around us, but we have our familial parental conditioning, and then we have, our own karmic conditions, which you can say all of these can relate to the archetype of Capricorn. Just quickly, since we're entering this last quadrant of the astrological wheel, yesterday I was talking about Sagittarius as the beginning of the hero's journey. This is the heeding the call, answering the call to adventure, using some of Joseph Campbell's language on the hero's journey. To me, and just briefly, Capricorn is this stage that Campbell talks about called atonement with the Father. And if you break that up, it's at one-ment with the Father. So there's some reconciliation that needs to happen. And in Capricorn, the archetype so strongly speaks of deconditioning. One needs to decondition from prior imprints or prior things that one has conformed to. And so this atonement with the Father, or the at-one-ment with the Father, becomes the challenging, the unconscious patterns. I mean, the point with any conditioning is, you know, you don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things that are valuable from our ancestry and our traditions and our lineage. But it's only when we enact our conditioning unconsciously. You know, when you start to discover and, you know, explore why you do what you do, you know, the reasons, the way that you do things that you do, and maybe you start to discover, oh, I'm doing that because that's the way this has always been done. There's a should to it. There's a ancestral, familial, societal, some kind of should, which is a very Capricorn thing. Some of those things may be very valuable, some of the things that you've been taught by your culture, by your family, but other ones may be so unconscious that in the process of making them conscious, you need to change them, throw them out. So what we have in this quadrant is this kind of working with these imprints or conditioning from, because I was talking about imprinting specifically in the Cancer archetype, and overt conditioning in the Cancer archetype. So you have this, and then you have the deconditioning, and then you have individuation in the Aquarian archetype, and then the final surrender. So this is the development of the transpersonal self. This is the ultimate, you know, the hero's journey is the ultimate spiritual journey. It's developing one's personal self to the highest apex, which is Capricorn, of personal mastery. It's mastery over the physical world. It's mastery over the structures and the systems. It's mastery over oneself that then becomes individuation and then final surrender to the divine, where even this great prize that you have of having discovered all of this power within yourself eventually also needs to be surrendered in the final quarter. Now, very quickly, I made, and it's in my book, I did little analogies between two modern myths, Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings. And so when I was talking about this yesterday, that fatherless archetype, right, in Sagittarius, how I said, oh, I often see that in clients that have that energy of moving into the hero's journey themselves, that part of their life meaning is about they need to set off on that journey and do this mastery. So just for example, if you take Luke Skywalker and Frodo, they were both fatherless, right? Frodo had Bilbo as an uncle, but not a biological father. And he had what I call heavenly fathers, the same as Luke Skywalker did. Obi-Wan Kenobi is his heavenly father. And I think that these are mentors. This is the archetypal role that the father plays. That's what I was saying. Mother archetypally develops the inner world and the ability to be in contact with one's emotions and development of the inner world. Father is the outer world. So the archetype of father is this ability to bring oneself into the outer world. Now, I suspect that the reason why in the hero's journey the biological father is absent is because basically the biological father would condition the child too much to leave them, you know, so they get the pure archetypal mentor, you know, Gandalf and Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? They're the heavenly fathers. They don't have too much emotional enmeshment with them like you would with a biological father, so that they can serve as an authentic view of this authentic self, which is meant to be developed and then surrendered through this process. Sagittarius is the authentic self. So this is setting off on the quest to find the authentic self. So then you have Bilbo and Luke Skywalker, of course, setting off on their quest. Star Wars is a little more complicated in the father archetype because Luke discovers that his father was Darth Vader. It's very symbolic. Because prior to that, he had this idealized image of his father as a great Jedi, right? And then through his own process of deconditioning, right, just what I'm talking about, he learns the truth about his father. And that's, I mean, I'm sure all of you can say at one point in your life when you realized your parents were human. Wasn't that the beginning of your deconditioning, right? Like all of a sudden you realized they had faults. They were human. They're doing something wrong. That's exactly what that energy of deconditioning is. So that was kind of Luke's moment, right? You know, that he meets his, and finds out, oh my God, this is my father. And then he goes through that whole thing in the cave before he met his father, basically seeing the shadow, the potential of what he could become. He could become Darth Vader. And then they have the confrontation, and he cuts off the hand. I don't know if you guys remember this. And he looks down at his mechanical hand and his father, and then it's almost like, oh my God, I'm going to become him, right? With his integrity, Sagittarius, also Capricorn's a lot about integrity and honor, right? But by him staying to his own authority and his own model of who he wanted to be, he did exactly what Campbell talks about. He's the one who saved his father. So he had a complete reconciliation with the father archetype because, you know, in the end he ends up I don't want to say resurrecting, what would be the word? I mean, he rescues Darth Vader, you know. Redeeming, thank you, that's exactly the word I was looking for. He redeems him, right? That's the atonement with the father. So then when we move into the Aquarius archetype, you know, this is the part of the hero's journey where through their own mastery and their individuation, they then need to share their gifts with their community, right? So all the heroes are always off on some journey to save the world. It's always something big, you know. But that's part of what that Aquarian archetype is about, the pouring of oneself, you know, that your individuated process is not solely about yourself. It's as you become more of a unique individual, you then have more to share with humanity. And in fact, I have another quote from Jung about that. Jung talks about individuation. And he says, since the individual is not only a single separate being, but by his very existence also presupposes a collective relationship, the process of individuation must clearly lead to a more intensive and universal collective solidarity and not to mere isolation. And that's part of the quandary of, because I'm sure you know, that Aquarius has a dual rulership, Saturn and Uranus, right? And so a lot of this Capricornian stuff carries over into Aquarius. And so there's that simultaneous still deconditioning and rebelling against conditions, yet also using the gifts, the fruits of what one was, you know, what one inherited, and making it their own in the Aquarius archetype. But again, in the very early stages of individuation, there's a lot of rebellion, and a lot of times it's the whole throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and it's like you can liken that to your teenage years. You know, where you totally, but that's not individuation. That's the beginning of individuation. So we have that in the Aquarius archetype, but what then you also have is the higher octave of that, which is Prometheus. Prometheus in the Aquarian archetype, you know, is the one who steals the fire from the gods and brings it down to humanity, right? And so we have that's the potential of the Aquarian archetype in the natural archetype, is through one's process of individuation, right? It is to become aware of what is unique and special within you, so that you then become, and the things that you pour out become a gift to humanity. And then, so when you look at the, you know, in the myths that I was talking about, in the final stage, like getting back to Frodo, for example, when he went through all of his, you know, bringing the ring to them, this is all the tests and trials of you know, the Capricorn phase of self-mastery, the discipline and the tests and the trials, when he was trudging through Mordor and trying to get the ring to Mount Doom and all of that. And then when he comes back to Bag End and he has this knowledge, he's weary still, there's a weariness within him, yet he writes it down, right? Which to me is also kind of harkens back to Gemini Sag. When you have that, when you have conquered, you have to share it in some way. So his writing this down and then passing it along to Sam, right, is this kind of, you know, the Gemini Sag thing and also the Aquarian thing. He writes down his journey and then he passes the torch, right? Very Promethean. And in the end, he's granted the greatest boon where he's able to leave with his heavenly father and the elves, right? because, you know, he's mastered this, so he's become the master of the physical plane. And supposedly, one can say that because he's mastered that, he can now penetrate both worlds. And so he's allowed access. This is enlightenment, right? In a way, you would say that metaphorically, that's what that shows. You know, he's reached that stage and he's allowed to enter into the heavenly realms. So that's just briefly, I wanted to touch on that, because that last quadrant of the chart this also correlates in evolutionary astrology, again, archetypally. It's not that you're applying it to individual charts, to the various evolutionary stages. Consensus stage is ruled by Saturn, individuated is ruled by Uranus, and spirituated state is ruled by Neptune, Pisces. And each has their 3 substages within it. So, just to give you an idea. Okay. Moving to Capricorn in past life context. So we have Saturn, we have structure, we have limitations. Any ideas? Where are you going to take that? What? Yeah, it sounds great. You know, take that into some past life stories. You've got confinement, oppression. I always call Capricorn the sign of the shuns, right? It's oppression, depression, repression, suppression, right? Those, I call them the 4 apocalyptic horsemen of the Capricorn archetype. And they show up that way in past life stories. You also have, as I said, conditioning. You have, you know, oftentimes a lot of slavery lives, confinement. Like I said, I have Saturn conjunct my South Node. I've died in a lot of dungeons, died in chains a lot, right? It's a confinement archetype. There's also the idea of responsibility. And, you know, each kind of South Node has its kind of typical things that they say in relation to their karmas. And like I always say, my Capricornian in the karmic axis clients that come in usually are coming in always saying, it's all my I feel like it's all my responsibility, or it's all my fault. Yeah, it's all my fault, it's all my responsibility, I'm the guilty one, blah, blah, blah. Depression is another kind of resonant thing that carries with those Saturnian, Capricornian karmic signatures. And, you know, die in captivity enough and that'll happen. Die in slavery enough or have those kinds of lives with oppression and repression. I mean, Jeffrey talks about the Capricorn, Venus in Capricorn comes in with grief. It's a grief signature. And I find that so much with the Capricorn in the past life. There's often, you know, people have sometimes been in clouds of grief in wartime, you know, families grieving over. I had one Capricorn South Node client who her whole past life was just one person dying after another in the family from the time she was like a 3-year-old. So she just grew up in this cloud of constant grieving. And it was just one grief after another grief after another grief. And I mean, it wasn't even that her life was so horribly traumatic. It was more this subtle energy that she grew up in that, you know, carried into her current life as this kind of cloud of grief, which can manifest as an existential kind of depression. You know, again, echoing what Mark said, depression, it can be a natural pulling in. There's, you know, we have our reasons to kind of turn in and be out, to be animated and to be internal, right? To be extroverted and introverted. And sometimes depression is the, you know, where you're cocooning. You need to do that, right? If we lived in pagan times and we followed natural cycles, we'd all be like really depressed in the winter. And that would be okay, right? Because all of the energy goes underground. So we would follow that cycle and that would happen, you know, it happens to us anyway. But since we live in this work and productivity, everything is always about growth and progress, that's just not allowed. Grief isn't allowed in our society. You know, you go and bury a loved one and you're supposed to be back at work in 2 days. To some cultures, that's insane. You know? It is insane. you know? I mean, there's some cultures, and again, because I do a lot of that ancestor work, I've done a lot of study of different grieving traditions, and, you know, some shamanic cultures, some Native American cultures have 2-3 year rituals for the dead. I mean, there's reasons for that, right? Yes?
Even in I remember reading classical Greek plays and stuff, and even when there were wars and there were violent enemies, when people died, they took time off for burial, and those burial rites and that grief and mourning period were completely sacred and respected even with warring factions.
Yeah.
So it's, I mean...
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we were talking about this at the table at lunch. So all of those things unresolved in the psyche can carry forward into the current life as depression. Depression can have a karmic root as well. I would say most of the time probably does have a karmic root somewhere. So, I put those up. That's the astro movements I was talking about. That she's up there, Phoebe Weiss. You can look her up on YouTube.
What's interesting is the USA is a Cancer nation, is that correct?
Yes.
And that we're totally Capricornian, you know.
We have a Pluto in Capricorn.
Just...
We have a Pluto in Capricorn.
Oh, I see. So we're having a Pluto return.
Yeah, yeah. There will be a Pluto return, yeah.
And that in our culture we have such a hard time with the dying process.
Yeah.
And you know, I think of Saturn and aging.
Yes.
And Dylan Thomas's poem about rage against the, you know, don't go easy into the, you know, rage against, yeah. And recently I was at a James Hillman workshop and he did Puree and Senex and he talked about that and how much, you know, how much we need to, you know, the whole thing about growing old in this population, like, you know, and how that melancholy that just kind of hangs around instead of, you know, he says rage against the dying of the light. It's not like a physical fight, but just inside us, you know, where we come from with that old age process.
Yeah, well, now they have a term ageism, right, as a kind of discrimination. But I mean, the point is, you know, we don't respect our elders, so they don't have that place in society. So of course there's that, you know, it's a bit of a taboo. We're so, like, you know, youth-oriented and no wrinkles and whatever in our culture.
That's not natural law. The natural law is to honor the elder, you
Absolutely.
know, as our teachers.
The wizened, yeah. I mean, Capricorn archetypally is also, like I said, it's the mastery of the physical, right? It's the wizard. So, you know, when you reach your golden years, there's that archetype there, the crone, right? She's the opposite the mother. She's the crone too.
Maybe the Pluto and Leo generation will demand that.
I always say that. I said, you Pluto Leos are not going to grow old gracefully. They are raging against the machine, right? You guys, the Pluto Leos, are the ones that changed, like the new 60 is the old 40, right? Totally. Totally.
And there are many shamanic cultures that actually believe that one of the reasons our society is so kind of fucked up is because we don't have the dying rites, and spirits don't know they're dead, and there's more spirit possession, and
exactly.
it becomes so pervasive. And
we were talking about this on the lunch break, and I was making a reference to Malidoma Some, who's a Dagara shaman, and he works, African Dagaran shaman, and he works very specifically with grief and grieving rituals. And he said that the Western world has thousands of years of grieving still to do. Thousands of years, because none of the dead have been properly grieved. And when that happens, there's clouds of them, clouds and clouds, and it just keeps building and building and building. And we were talking about the clouds in Europe and how when you drive around country to country, you can feel the differences between the countries and all of the psychic layers that are there and all the clouds of spirit. But he would say, because our tears, in one way, allow the ancestors to pass to the other side. They need our tears to help them pass. We have this, and you'll get me off on a whole other tangent, which I won't try not to pull back from. But, you know, we don't have these death rituals. So it's like we kind of like, you know, stick them full of formaldehyde. Who thought up this? I mean, okay, maybe the Egyptians, but they had a different intention, right? You know, stick them full of formaldehyde, you know, and just kind of in a couple days, and that's it, and then you all go out to dinner, and then it's over, and everybody goes back to work. Yes,
prayer
yes,
for the parents, or I mean, I did that
yeah.
for both of my parents illegally because I didn't go to a temple where there was a minion. But
Yeah,
but it, I mean, I cried every day for a year
yeah, yeah.
and longer actually. So
Yeah, I mean, I lost my dad in November, and, you know, it's a grieving process, you know? Yeah.
Nuclear family due to, you know, with technology in the picture, and we branched off from our people, our peeps, you know,
Yeah.
our family, and became isolated and
Well,
satellite.
I just think that whole nuclear family thing is a failed experiment, you know? I mean, it's like we've tried it, not working. Yeah.
Like we talked about, now the kids are coming back home, you know, the big kids.
The elders, right? You know,
Yeah.
Capricorn, right? Yeah, the extended elders, yeah. The extended family. Sure. Good observation. So, okay. Oh, wait, I have a few things I want to show you about this chart. This is one of the cases. This is in the book. It's also in the compilation book. Let me just get the right transits here. Okay, this is one that I wanted to show you about transits. Okay. So, we have a Capricorn South Node, speaking of the grief signature, right? Capricorn South Node with Venus, all of that stuff there is stuffed in the second house, right? Can you feel the energy of that? And Pluto in Virgo in the 10th. So we have a double Capricorn signature here, right? So it's really Capricorn. This squares the nodes. Jupiter in Aries in the 5th house squares the nodes. And if I've got several past life stories from her, but one very specific one I want to focus on. Some of them bring this aspect in more. She was a commodities trader. Working, her building was, I believe, one of the ones across the street from the World Trade Centers, the other one that collapsed. And their office was in there. Had a lot of friends in the World Trade Center, worked in the World Trade Center. A lot of her colleagues from her company had cross offices and so on. So when the World Trade Center went down, she was not there. She was off on business, but of course had this huge vicarious trauma happen because she lost a lot of friends, and the company was almost destroyed. It's a huge multinational company with headquarters in New York. So her reaction to it was obviously vicarious trauma, and her first thought was, I couldn't save them, and it's all my fault. Right? And so she went into overdrive. She went into her Aries, Jupiter, overdrive, right? And so now you can look at the transits, right? Now, thinking of the Jupiter square to the nodes, look at Jupiter. Exact, right? It was exact conjunct the south node. And this is a critical part of her karmic axis, right? So, I mean, you know, it's like you can't get any closer there. And so she went into overdrive and went into hero and savior mode over here and on a mission. We're going to save the company. She was totally in the Jupiter Aries thing. And all the workers rallied around and they're like, we're going to save the company. And it was all a protection against this grief, this immense sense of not only the Virgonian, but the Capricornian sense of responsibility. Some part of her really believed it was all her fault. Talk about inflation. Right? Jupiter, right? It's all my fault. In Aries. In the 5th house, need I say more? Inflation of a guilt complex, right? You know, again, it's not a pejorative. It's that there is some past life character that feels that responsible, right? And it becomes that inflated because it's unresolved within the psyche. And I have to put up another one. So what I'm going to show you is when she started therapy, which is quite interesting when you see the tri-wheel. Okay. Thanks. Bink. Okay. so we got that one, we got that one, and then that one. Okay, so she went into overdrive and burned out. She pretty much was on the edge of like total nervous breakdown, needed to take a hiatus from the company. I think she was in overdrive for 1, 2, 3 years. Her whole system pretty much gave out. She couldn't do it anymore. She was such a warrior. She was in complete warrior mode, right? That you could see that she's got the double signature. She's got the Aries and the Capricorn. She's got the warrior and the soldier, right? Doing my duty, doing my responsibility. So she pretty much burned out on that and did some traditional therapy, which helped her. She took a hiatus and bought a place up in the mountains outside of New York. And then eventually came around to needing to do some deeper work, right? So obviously she needed to be stabilized, and she did this therapy. And then this is right when she started therapy, this outer wheel. So look what's happening. Look where Jupiter is. Right? So the exact transit that triggered that before has now come halfway across the chart, and it's over here. Pluto is applying to the south node, right? And we've got Venus over here too. What's even funnier is that right now she's having the reverse nodal return, and I just saw her before I came here, right? And I said, I was kind of curious. I'm like, so, you know, all that stuff you worked on, how's that manifest? You know, there's a return on a higher level to all this stuff coming up in her life now. And all these questions of duty and responsibility are coming up again while she's having the nodal return, right? And Pluto was still obviously hanging out there, so, you know. So let me just go back to the natal chart for simplicity when I tell you the story. Well, I mean, she's revisiting these issues again. But again, on a higher turn of the spiral. She's still, because she's a Capricorn South Node with Pluto in the 10th house, she's still working out her relationship to what is her responsibility and what isn't her responsibility, right? So there's layers of that. The work that was done on these past lives, like, really did erode a rooter on some of the very deep issues of where it was this compulsive responsibility. So now she's working on a higher turn of the spiral on still sorting that out, right? So it's a kind of return, but it is interesting to see because it is definitely a higher turn of the spiral. So basically, she went into a past life as a World War II, we are going to assume it's World War II and also assume it's Normandy. I mean, it was pretty clear what it was in the regression. She's some kind of commander in the storming of Normandy. And so it's like her, and she's got a second, and okay, now I have to refer to her as him. Okay, you guys get that? So he is, they're doing some beach landing, and he had his orders. And, you know, Capricorns follow their orders. Had his orders, but as they start to get into the fray of what the battle is that's going on, the commander realizes, if I follow the orders the way that they were given to me, we're all goners. It's a complete slaughter. So kind of quickly is trying to make these calculation strategies, very Capricorn, of what is the best way to kind of still accomplish the mission, Aries, yet, you know, try to save as many lives as possible. So, of course, the feeling is, it's all my responsibility. You know, all of these men's lives are my responsibility. And at one point, realizes that the only way to accomplish a mission to save any of their lives is to send half of them into slaughter, knowing that that's what's going to happen. And hoping that they can cut some swath and land the others safely. So he turns to the second in command, and, you know, the issue on battlefields is it isn't time for long pensive thought, and looks to the second in command, and they both know. It's like their eyes meet, and they both know what it means, that he's basically saying, you and those guys go get slaughtered so these guys can survive. But, you know, it's like one of those moments. And, of course, the crushing of what happened inside that commander in that moment when it was being worked in regression was immense, right? The immense amount of... But, again, you don't, you know, you have to do your duty, follow your orders. It's in the fray of battle. Turns to the second in command. He takes the others. They go. Pretty much they get slaughtered. And so then they're landing. And then they all got overwhelmed. I mean, it was just chaos, right, as most battles are. And he gets shot. But the men were so heroic in saving him, and they were actually, he got shot and kind of instantly paralyzed. And the men are dragging his body. And he feels like such a shit. You know, like, I don't, just like, leave me here to die. I don't deserve, you know, it was total, like, I can't believe what I've done. They're all going to get slaughtered. It's, again, all my fault, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so the men are really trying to save their commander, and they're under fire, and it's just craziness. And eventually, again, he dies. Because that's what happens in our past lives. He dies, obviously, in a cloud of guilt, in a, you know, all of those imprints. And not, again, surprisingly, that's where that part of her soul stayed. That commander was still on the beach, basically. So when we worked with that in the past life, the first things that had to happen was, of course, trying to get the commander to, you know, realize it's over, he's dead, and blah, blah, blah. So progressively, as that was happening, one of the really beautiful things that happened is quite frequently, and just like we were talking about, clouds of spirits. Well, quite frequently in battlefields and mass traumas, clouds of spirits can still be hanging around. So we're kind of, I said, as a way to kind of make the commander feel better, I'm like, let's see if any of these spirits are stuck here. Because if he can start to help others, he's going to start to feel better about himself. So let's look and see if there's any souls that are stuck here like you were, and we can rescue them. And that will help him to start to atone, right? Because there's going to be that need of feeling like I need to do something because I was such a crud in the past. So anyway, we start to do that. And he comes up to this soldier who's, like she's describing it, he's like standing sentinel on the beach. And comes up to him in her journey, and the soldier says, yes, and this was really beautiful. The spirit of this soldier turned around and said, yes, I am still here on the beach, but I'm not here for the reason that you were. He said, I'm here because I'm standing sentinel to guard the freedom that you won with your blood. Oh, and then the tears came, and then the tears came. And, you know, this is such a powerful message for Capricorn, which is about honor and integrity. It's also Sagittarius, right? And so what you also have to realize is that commander died and never knew if they won the war. He didn't know. He was in the midst of it. You know, and in essence, all war cruds, but in essence, and I've worked with World War II veterans and working with present life World War II veterans, working with World War II veterans as opposed to Vietnam veterans, huge difference in the imprints, right? Because World War II culturally was looked at as an honorable war, right? Vietnam had a whole different imprint. So basically, you know, this spirit says, I am standing sentinel. So that was the first release for this commander, just grieving. It was gratefulness and grieving. And then some of the spirits of his men came, and they said, we won. You know, it's okay. It's like it's over. We won. And, of course, a lot of grieving and releasing. And, you know, it's just so critical. I mean, this is the thing about grief. Grief has to happen. It's that simple. You know, if you have locked up grief, the way to release it is to grieve. That's what has to happen. And so this commander was never able to grieve, and that's what was part of all that she was still carrying. So as that happened, they all kind of went up into the bardo, and yes, I see a lot of you. They all went up into the bardo, and it was resolved, or more resolved. Her comments about this work were interesting in that the thing here is that if this commander, now when you see, when I see the Capricorn signature moving to Cancer, the message is obviously any part of the feeling emotional body that's become hardened, Capricorn, needs to soften. It needs to flow again. Part of the message of Capricorn moving to Cancer is reuniting and realigning with the emotional body and the parts of the emotional body that have been repressed, suppressed, oppressed, depressed, right? So that's part of the learning. The thing is that sometimes when you come into very Capricorn imprints and they're totally moving to the Cancer archetype, accessing the feeling is very difficult because it's so deeply repressed. Well, this is the point. But with her, well, the thing is, with her, what you would have seen if it was a pure, because the nodes are squared, this is part of her past life experience also. So within this soul, there has been both Cancer and Capricorn, and you could see it in that commander. Because, you know, I've worked with the pure Capricorns. They're ruthless. There's no feeling, right? It would have been you over there, get killed. You over there, get, you know, nothing, right? No, like no feeling, right? But she did care. He did care. And the reason why is because this was part of the past life experience. The commander had the capacity to feel already, albeit wounded. And so the way it was manifesting in her current life was for her, whenever she got into caring, she had a barrier around her, not letting people close, right? That's the Capricornian thing. We saw that in Michelle's story, right?
Same chart.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's like a couple, it's a day late.
Oh, okay.
In
Different houses, right.
Yeah, I'm a 28 rising.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's the same. It's that Michelle had that. Don't come near me, right? She had it for very real reasons. Don't come near me. She was saying when she was in the closet, became an emotional. Don't come near me, right? So she had the same kind of barriers, you know, Saturnian barriers around her. But the reasons why she said after she worked with this commander, she said several things happened. First, she suddenly didn't feel that September 11th was her personal responsibility. That was the biggest thing. That she said, I never realized how much I thought it was my personal. And she was able to step outside of it and see that the events were so out of her control, out of anybody's control, right? So that was the first relief for her energy. The second was that she had said that in her life, what she realized was part of the reason for that boundary was that in her consciousness, caring had meant life and death, right? Again, Cancer in the 8th house, right? If I care for them, they're going to die. Or, you know, what caring equates decisions over life and death. And so why would you let somebody in your world if it has that gravity to it? You know, so in her consciousness it had that scorpionic gravity. So again, that loosened. So during this time in her life, she was changing careers and actually went out of that kind of cold calculating world of commodities and blah, 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 and moved into personal coaching and started working as an executive coach. Now, yes, she's still very Capricorn in the corporate model, right? It's her level of consciousness and where she's at, and it's. I would say third stage, moving or somewhere in individuated, early individuated. Yes, which goes against my earlier statement that consensus people never do regression. But no, I'd say she's into the individuated. Yeah.
First stage individuated, you think?
Yeah. Yeah, first, second. Yeah, there's some overtones of other stuff there, too.
Joan Baez, Richard Nixon, two kinds of Capricorns. They share the same birthday.
And there you go, evolutionary states, right, in action, right? Same, yeah, as those birth dates? Oh, because he's a Capricorn, right. Oh, okay. Elvis. Oh, okay.
Question.
Yes, sorry.
So these spirits that met him said to him that they'd won the war.
That what?
They'd won the war. There was
Yeah.
this kind of ameliorating factor that you know, or relieving kind of a factor there. So there's a lot of soldiers and so on who are in those kind of states who did not win,
Yeah.
you know, battles or wars. What kind of complicating factors would be, or what kind of other layers would be with something like that?
Well, that's what I was talking about when I said even in present life. I've worked with World War II veterans. I mean, they're very old. I have a lot of interesting stories from them, actually. And Vietnam veterans. And the imprint is very different, right? Like the World War II veteran can have more of a sense of an honor, yet they don't talk about the atrocities that happened. It's a whole different thing, where the Vietnam vets feel just so dishonored and so stripped, and most of them disillusioned, right? Like the World War II vets can still feel a little like, yeah. You know, the Vietnam vets are like disillusionment, right? I haven't worked with any of them, I don't know. Well, I mean, I've worked with them in past lives, you know, and in past lives there is oftentimes guilt, and that also falls under the Capricorn archetype, because oftentimes it's that kind of looking of, look what I did because I was part of the machine, you know, and it's that's part of Capricorn, is like getting sucked into the machine, and, you know, the machine just is deciding your actions, again, very consensus. Right, and so after those lives, they often look back and they're just like, wow, I you know, had I been an individual, I wouldn't have made those choices, but it was I was part of the machine, right? Does that answer your question?
So Patricia, when you work with like the World War II, or as compared to the World War II, the Vietnam veteran, what, you know, you can talk to the World War II ones, that you won the war, you're honored, da-da-da-da. How do you handle the Vietnam ones?
That's a whole other discussion, yeah. Although it's appropriate for this archetype, because in my book I make the very clear distinction about the Aries warrior and the Capricorn soldier. And they're both part of the same, you know, they're both part of the war machine in different ways. But, you know, the Capricorn soldier is the one following his duty and his responsibility, and, you know, oftentimes the tradition and the ancestry, and following in the footsteps of the father, because my father was, you know, in the so on and so forth. And that's where you get that in the Capricorn kind. And the deconditioning of the Capricorn soldier often happens when they hit disillusionment, right? Later in the Pisces archetype, when they hit disillusionment, that, you know, they have to kind of climb the military ladder, life after life after life, but there's always some lifetime. Again, if they're at the end of the warrior cycle, and this is a whole other discussion, but when we talk about the warrior cycle and what it means to a soul that's been working through the karma of the warrior soldier cycle, at some point they hit disillusionment. And the disillusionment is the beginning of the awakening of the spiritual warrior and the ending of the warrior karma. But they have to hit that place of disillusionment. So in a way, getting back to the Vietnam vets, a lot of them are there. Like the system failed them, the people failed, everything failed them. And they go into disillusionment, and their unhealed disillusionment is part of the trauma, outside of the atrocities and all of the fragmentation and dissociation that they experienced, it's because that disillusionment is not healed. So, you know, working to bring that, as Mark was talking about when he talked about Uranus and the Pisces archetype, working to get to what is the reason for that disillusionment, the higher reason for that. What is that bringing in? What is that crack in the psyche opening up? Which is basically saying, you know, the system failed you for a reason, because you're better than that. You know, you're evolving beyond that.
I had just read a statistic that there were more deaths from suicide after the Vietnam War, the returning veterans, than there were those who died in Vietnam.
Yeah. You know, there's a lot that's been said, and I only know from my little clip of experience of World War II veterans, which is very small, because they don't talk about what happened. But the ones that do, it's also that generation too, you know. But there were a lot of atrocities, right? There was a lot of stuff that they did that they do feel shamed about, but they never. I mean, I had one guy tell me stuff that his wife was in the next room, and he said, I've never even told her. Right? They've been married for like 70 years or whatever. you know, and it was killing somebody, a Belgian woman, for bread. You know, I mean, there was a lot of stuff like that that happened too, not quite to the extremes of Vietnam, but war is hell. I mean, come on, who are we kidding? War is war. The atrocities of war are just that way. Yes?
Actually, on that statistic about homicides and suicides, I had read something the other day, just in general, that I think it was a study across like 16 states that there are more suicides than homicides, period.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh.
But on this axis, this nodal axis with the Jupiter, so basically, in order for this to get healed, they had to revisit the past in order to move to the future. Is that correct?
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
This
So-
is the resolution.
So 9/11 was basically, it's something that had to be revisited.
Yeah.
In one form or another.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's also a cool thing about the cardinal archetypes, and I always think Capricorn in specific, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Growth within this archetype is actually movement forward and then backward. It's kind of a retrograde. It's like it's a little bit forward, a little bit back, a little bit forward, a little bit back. And just like I said, in her evolution, that's exactly how, if I were observing her, I would say that's how she does her growth. Right? It's a little bit forward, a little bit back, a little bit forward, a little bit back. She also spontaneously did, and we're talking about the ending of the warrior karma, she also spontaneously, as that commander in the Bardo, one of the first things, after we did all of that with the other sentinels and the other soldiers, they got up into the Bardo, this commander requested to have his hands washed. Not that he was in hand-to-hand combat, but it was the symbolic gesture. And what I loved about that is that archetypally, this is what our soldiers, part of what our soldiers and warriors are missing. In African traditions or any of the warrior traditions, there's a symbolic act that happens when they return to the community called the washing of the spears. Right? And I mean, the warrior is created within the community and then let go from the community. In what we don't have, that they have in many tribal communities, is how to reintegrate that warrior in the community. And there are equal rituals, just like the making of a warrior, there are equal rituals to return that warrior back to the community so that they can integrate the experiences of that and still be useful within the community. This is the huge thing that we're missing. And in some tribes, that's a very elaborate process of bringing the warriors back to the community. One of that is that it's a ritual called the washing of the spears. And that to me, I saw that as that very Aries signature, right? The pure blood and violence of just, you know, to cleanse oneself. She also had another life, which it's in the book, if you get the book, you read it, which really had a lot of this with the Capricorn signature about feeling like a failure and a fraud. And that's another level. And when you have an unresolved fraud in your past, if you think you've been a fraud or you feel like a fraud, it often acts as a saboteur in your current life. So recognize that with your Capricorn people, because lots of times there's that desire for achievement, and when you see that in people, right, you'll often find the Capricorn signature involved. Capricorn, Saturn, 10th house involved somewhere where they're pushing for achievement, but something always trips them up. You know, when they're always tripping themselves up in some way, that's a saboteur sitting in the background. And that's a hidden either guilt, lots of times a feeling of being a fraud. And so she had that also. That was another part of healing her levels of accomplishment. Okay. Thank you. So thirsty.
One thing is you're totally honest. In front of them or behind
Yeah.
them, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I know. I know. Okay. So any final thoughts on Capricorn before we move on? None. Let's go. Sorry? Suppression. Yeah. Okay, regression.
Do you find that there are signs that are harder than others? Like, I mean, it's, obviously because of the nature of their work. They're all going to be a little bit difficult and
They all have their little
traumatized.
quirks.
Yeah.
It's like, the Libran regressions are all about the denial, right? And the Taurus is all like, you really got to get it out of the body, and then there's the repression and da-da-da, and then there's the splitting and they all have their thing. They all have their thing. Geminis like tell too many stories. I mean, I can tell you, the Gemini South nodes, their regressions are so elaborate. They're like, and then I was wearing this pink dress, and it was made out of cotton, and I know because my father used to grow cotton, and you're like, I know. Okay. So moving into Aquarius. So, the Aquarian archetype, you've obviously spent a lot of time with Mark talking about Uranus and Aquarius, etc. I'm just thinking if there's anything further I want to say on trauma. I don't know, do we have any blank paper here? Do we have any markers up here? Yeah, okay. Let me see if I want to do this or not. Oh, that's a light pen. I was talking before about trauma and the fragmenting of the psyche and so on and so forth. To me, the way that I see these things arise, trauma is the propensity of the psyche. So you have Capricorn, the structure of consciousness. Saturn is not only structure, but it's in evolutionary astrology, it's the basic structure of consciousness. It's how any organism, any consciousness is structured. Saturn. Following that in Aquarius, and again, Saturn follows into Aquarius as co-ruler, you have the propensity, as I say, the propensity of the psyche to fragment. Right? And that's where you get that archetype, where you get trauma fragments the psyche. Right? Shock, hitting something solid, will fragment. Right? Uranus, Saturn. Shock, Saturn, solid, they hit, the solid thing is going to fragment. That's the consciousness. Right? And that's what I was saying before about when you're present in some kind of trauma, the propensity is to fragment if the trauma is overwhelming. Then, moving into Pisces, you have more the propensity to dissociate. Just go away. I'm out of here. Right? And you'll see that as we get into the Piscean archetype, which we all know is traditionally associated with escapism and addiction and, blah, 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 checking out, spacing out, all of that. On a trauma level, though, it's the dissociation within the Pisces archetype that shows up the most. I have a case in Aquarius, but before I get into, well, maybe I'll talk about hers first. Okay. I'm going to try to run through this one quick. So, this client came to me, when we're talking about fragmentation and dissociation, she kind of has double signatures here. I'll point them out in a minute. She came to me, but I want you to just first look at the pattern of the chart. It's what they call a splay pattern. Yeah, exactly. She just went, whoop. It's like, yeah, all over, right? So some of the first words out of this client's mouth were, she said, I feel like a starfish, like all my legs are cut off, like I'm being pulled in every direction. She also said something like, I feel like I'm living a story that's not my own. That's chronic, that's dissociation. Right? Dissociation is this kind of watching your life. I know, I didn't come into my body till I was somewhere in my 30s. I very distinctly remember most of grammar school and high school watching myself as if I was in a movie. It was all the dissociation, right? It was all that unhealed karmic stuff that I brought in, which is why I do what I do. Like I said, it's like I had to do it. So with her, again, you can kind of look at it and go, where's the Aquarius? I mean, I like these charts when it doesn't so show the overt signature, but it's right here. Mars in the 11th square the nodes. You also have this, the Chiron in Aquarius opposed Pluto. So you have a double kind of thing. Now Saturn is Chronos in time, and this is the thing I wanted to try to describe when we talk about the ontology of trauma. Saturn is Chronos in time, right? It's the structure. Things happen chronologically and ordered. And you know, in Uranus, you get a bit multi-dimensional, right? You know, we were doing your chart yesterday in the 11th house, right? You're like, that was part of your quandary, right? Like, how do I bring together that Uranian and Piscean and Saturnian thing, right? And your thing was like, I never have the structure of the time. So part of what happens during trauma, when you have fragmentation and then dissociation, is that the perception of time changes, and that's part of why you have PTSD. So you have this structure that's kind of going along, and this structure is also the body, going along and doing something, and a trauma hits, and part of you evacuates, and part of you is out of there. What normally happens is that the part that was left to experience the trauma is the body, this part of the consciousness. The rest of you, like I, went to the beach or went to grandma's house or did something else, right? It went into some dissociative fantasy. So it has a whole different experience of reality than this does. So after the trauma happened, let's say, so the body survives the trauma, whatever it is. It can be a car accident, it can be an attack. Whatever it is, if there's a splitting, a fragmentation, and a dissociation, that's the dynamic that you're going to have, right? So it's like Saturn and Uranus and then Neptune. There's a splitting, trauma, fragmentation, and then I'm out of here. When those parts kind of sort of come back together, like after the trauma is over, what often happens is they don't come back together. And what you see is this kind of like this little band in the psyche. So it's like if you have a, let's just say that this is the etheric body, and the emotional body and the mental body and the spiritual body. So if you have like this little piece that flew off way out here and then the trauma's over and this kind of comes back in, it's like there's like a skip in the psyche. It's like a black band. Right? You'd see it etherically. But even without seeing it etherically, psychologically, it's like this gap. Because the experience of time and reality was different for the part that went away and the part that stayed. So there's an incongruence. They don't line up. That is an energetic description of what they call PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress syndrome. Right? It's this skip that's happened in the psyche. This piece is unable to reintegrate, and that's why you always have that kind of skip there. Now, the thing that I didn't mention is that the nature of trauma is repetitive, and part of that is because, again, in the Uranian archetype, like attracts like, right? And it's also, to me, the Uranian archetype is also about homeopathic, and the principle of soul healing works on the homeopathic principle, where like cures like. That is the basis of homeopathy. So what the soul is doing when we say, well, life after life after life, it is recreating the same patterns over and over and over. It's not because it's stupid. It's not because you're being punished. It's because the soul works on the principle of homeopathic. So if you experience the loss of a child in a past life and that's still a skip in the soul's record, the soul will continue to recreate from its own wounded place because it wants to heal that, right? So it'll bring it into the current life. Now it may be a complete replay or it may be symbolic. The fear of losing may still be there. In some way, it's going to be represented. Freud talked about this when he studied trauma. It's called repetition compulsion. Trauma has the propensity to repeat itself on anniversaries. I mean, there's whole studies on this, on anniversaries of traumatic events, blah, blah, blah. The point is, what applies to trauma in one single life, the principles of trauma, apply to the many lives of the soul. It's the same principle. So we have souls repeating, and that's why we get these karmic patterns. As I said before, there's some scars. 90% of your karma is a repetition. It's not retributive. You're just simply doing the same thing over and over and over, because the soul is attempting mastery. It's attempting healing. It's like, if I recreate that again, it wants to call for a different response. It wants to call for a different kind of healing to happen that didn't happen in the past. It's simply unfinished business.
Can a trauma be just an accident, like a bad transit?
That's what I said before. Car wreck or, an attack.
And it can be like...
Falling off your bike.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have any
Repercussions?
repercussion in...
Well, we can go through traumatic events and not experience splitting and dissociation. We can also stub our toe and trigger something deeper that then can trigger a whole complex that may be around that part of the body. Sometimes children falling off bikes just pick themselves up and get back on. Other kids fall off bikes and they'll never get on another bike, right? So obviously, there's no, and I think Mark said this too, there's no set, like, just because you have that, you are trying, the idea though is that because of the repetitive nature of trauma and because it applies to the many lives of the soul, that for the most part, we are already born with PTSD, all of us. We have some degree of unresolved trauma within us, right? Because basically, if you've lived anywhere on the planet in the last 10,000 years, right? Yeah. Just look at our history, okay? You were either the perpetrator or the victim. It's that simple.
Patricia, what's your idea on when people are in accidents or whatever and they get knocked unconscious for a short time or a long time? Where do they go? What happens?
Well, but this is what I'm talking about. She's asking people who get knocked unconscious, where do they go? I mean, where do you go when you dissociate in your conscious? It doesn't matter if you're knocked unconscious or not. A part of the consciousness can vacate. Dissociation is not always out there, but it's too complex to get into. Parts can also hide within. One can dissociate inward also. So where they go is less relevant to the idea that they have left. Elvis has left the building. Right? That's the problem. If you're conscious or unconscious, it doesn't necessarily matter, because that's why you get repressed memories, because you weren't there when it happened, right? You left the building. That's why you get repressed memories.
I'm sorry. Is that then what you were saying, I think yesterday, that is an opportunity to come in?
Yeah.
Them?
Yeah. Yeah, and here we go, right here. This is a case of that. Yes?
I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
Do you ever get any people in regression that have alien encounters?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
think
usually
they
that's
were
an
an
Uranian
alien in
archetype, absolutely, yeah.
in another life or
Yeah.
something?
Yeah.
You do get that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And also alien entity invasion. Right. And that's often and it's so funny how these things can be literal and metaphoric. So within the Uranian archetype, we have the idea of alienation, and then you also have aliens. It's the same thing. Okay, so let's get to this Uranian case. So here we have the Mars and the 11th square the nodes. So as I said, this woman came to me and she said, I feel like a starfish where all my arms have been cut off. I feel like I'm not really living my life, I'm living the wrong story. So again, as I was describing the dynamics of trauma and dissociation, she has both signatures with this heavy Piscean 12th house stuff and this. She was a nurse in 12th, right, Virgo, and had worked in convalescent homes for many, many, many years. That's such a great place to pick up spirits. So she has a propensity, let's just say because of traumas and all of this Piscean 12th house openness, she has a propensity to be a welcome mat for outside energies. Okay, so some of that came up, but that's not really the core work that I did with her, because to me, entity stuff is just an added to. The most important thing is to do the core work. The entities are like the parasites on the wound. We need to heal the wound, then we get rid of the parasites. When I worked with her, though, the first thing that came up was the spirit that was attached to her, and it was actually kind of funny. It was a farmer who was out fixing a fence, and then the next thing he knew, he was in her. That was pretty much the story. It was the spirit of this farmer who was like, I'm fixing my fence, and then I'm here. I don't know how I got here. Right. Well, and as, you know, again, I have my methods of how to get, you know, through regression. So what we found out is that the farmer was fixing the fence, and some truck had come by, or vehicle carrying logs, and one of them snapped off. And it all happened, again, shock, so fast that the farmer didn't know, and he was just smashed, and somehow his spirit became attached to her. He was not hard to get rid of, but you'll see why the spirit became attached to her, because again, as I was saying, the Uranian archetype, like attracts like. It's the same with what I was talking about the other day in symbolic resonance, and how our psyches work in symbolic resonance. So that farmer had a similar experience to one of her past lives. So the past life that we went to after releasing the farmer was, she was a farmer. And she was out riding, a young man though at the time, out riding his horse, and something spooked the horse and threw him, and he fell down, shattered his back. And, you know, again, I mean, I could say that, I could show you the signatures for that too. I often see those with Capricorn, with Saturn, Uranian contacts, right? You find shattered bone structures. So, so the horse throws this young man, and he shatters his back. The horse runs off, and he's out there in the middle of the woods alone. And it was pretty much a long, slow death. He just died out there. And went through this alternating kind of rage of, I'm dying too young, right? The Mars square the nodes, I never got to have my life, and so on and so forth. So her life, her own past life, was very similar to the spirit's, although her death happened more consciously because it took a long time. The interesting point with working with that farmer past life, and again, why I like this case so much is because, as I was saying, you know, Aquarius Uranus is also very multidimensional, right? It opens, now the psyche is opening up to many different dimensions. And her cases, this all happened in one session. We worked through this many layers in one session, all through the principle of symbolic resonance. So we went from a spirit to her past life, and then as she was on the mat and we were finishing up with her farmer past life, her back started twitching exactly where the farmer's back had been broken. But we had already worked with the healing, so something else was there. So when I addressed what was arising in her back, a demonic entity came out. and here you've got, you know, the Aries in the 8th house, blah, blah, blah. I was talking about all that stuff before. And this entity was just rage, and it was said, you know, I've been attached to her, I'm trying to kill her, I'm trying to stop her, I'm trying to block her, all that stuff. And so, again, using the principle of symbolic resonance, like attracts like, I just directed her, since the entity was so enraged, I asked her, go back in your life or any other lives where you felt that kind of rage. And bang, she went into herself as a 4-year-old girl, current life. And here's where we get to where the wounding happened, or this kind of Uranian shattering. So as a little 4-year-old, she's in this, her father is yelling at her. And she's being her normal, like a little 4-year-old should be, rebellious self. And she's stamping her foot and she's angry. And father freaking lost it, right? He was like, how dare you be angry? Screamed at her, and it was the force of, now you can see her expression of her will here, right? Her right to have an emotional reality fragmented because father just beat the heck out of her then. So here's this little 4-year-old girl, and again, this is what I'm talking about, the difference between the psyche fragmenting or dissociating. She was present, right? And when you have a solid object that meets a solid object, the weaker one's going to fragment. And that's what happened to her. So she's this little 4-year-old, and father, she was trying to fight father, right? She had that will. standing up to him. Bang. And that's where she fragmented. And the part that fragmented where this kind of opportunistic entity entered, and again, it was all taking opportunity of father's anger. And you might even say that this non-human entity that was attached to her was a fragment of father's rage, right? An introject. I mean, I treat them, doesn't matter what you call them, right? You treat them all in the same way that they need to be recognized, resolved, and released. So basically, part of the little girl, I followed her through the fragmenting process and the dissociation, and one little part of her went into some very dark place in terror. So she was just like, and when I was working with her, she just kind of crawled into the corner of the room and it was that little girl part. And that's the part we needed to get. That was the part that we needed to rescue. So, and you can see that here too, right? And so I forgot to mention, just again, Mars is the ruler of the South Node too, right? So it adds to that gravity of its square to the karmic signature. So this little girl part, that we're now working with, we got her back and, rescued her, got her to reintegrate. And as she was coming back into her, part of when you're doing child soul retrieval work, sometimes there's a dialoguing that happens between the adult self and the child self that's coming back, and also understanding what is it that I'm now accepting back into myself, because you kind of make a contract when you bring back fragmented pieces. There's a kind of contract that I will continue to honor you. So she was having this dialogue with the child self. It was very delicate work bringing the frightened child back. We did. She had this dialogue with that part of herself. And so this little child comes back, and she said, I don't understand this. The child is coming back, and she's pointing to her knees. What do you think she's saying to me? And I'm thinking, holy Capricorn, right? She's pointing to her knees. And I said, I think she's telling you that she's bringing back the ability to stand up for your rights, stand up for your emotional reality, right? That you have a right to. Because the whole thing was the back and the legs, right? Was the part that was wounded in that, the farmer, and then where the entity was, and it was all this weakening of that part of the body. And so the little girl is like, yes. And so when I asked for some animals to come to help, 2 came, a panther, and then again, the funny one, I mean, she didn't know anything about astrology, this woman. So the panther comes to protect her space and to allow her to have some of that fierceness back, right? The reclaiming of her will, the fragmented will that she needed to reclaim. And then she says, I don't know, there's this animal here with this really coarse hair, and it's like it's so close to my face, I can't see what it is, but I can feel it, and I can smell it, and she said, oh my God, it's a mountain goat. Right? So here's this, it's bringing back this empowered, right? This empowered ability to stand up for oneself, to have that protective boundary. So then, by the time we got back to the little angry entity, that was obviously no problem releasing it, because we had already taken care of the core wounding. So that just was the last piece of work that needed to happen. Thoughts? Yeah, holy multi-dimensional, right? It's like spirits, entities, little girls, present life, past life. I mean, it's all in this, yeah. But that's also very Aquarian, right? It's also very Piscean. It's like we're blurring the lines of reality in those signs. It's multi-dimensional. Yeah.
Regression, like this is a regression in childhood. This is not the regression in the past lives.
Yeah. It was a present life child soul retrieval.
Could it be achieved without going back in past life?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, present life regression is the same as past life regression, but you're just staying within the timeline. That's present life soul retrieval. But what you find, though, is, again, it's like I said before, trauma repeats itself. So if you really want to do the core work, yes, you can do it. And I work with people just do present life regression. Yes, you can do that, but you're going to find there's a deeper resonance somewhere in the past, frequently. I'm, again, not going to make that dictum that it's always like that, but frequently you're going to find that that resonance is in the past and that it was replayed in the current life. So yes, through the principle of symbolic resonance, working only with the current life fragmented, traumatized self will also reach through those spanses of time across space, time, dimension, realities, and touch those other parts of the self and help them heal. Yes, that's also true too.
And the fact that she had Mars square the node, we know that probably her karmic story involved some kind of violence that
Yes.
repeated itself in her early childhood.
Yes. Yes, and a fragmentation of the will. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even work with her further, but as I look at this chart now, I mean, I can see a mother being speared while she's in the womb, and she's the child in the womb, right? And just, you know, run through, and that's part of that very early experience where there's no protection.
Did she talk about her mother at all?
I don't remember. You know, actually, this case was quite a while ago. I don't remember her biography that way. Yeah, I mean, I remember father was a. Well, that was the other part of it. I forgot. We did release a whole bunch of elderly people that were with her too. That was another layer. That there was this whole cloud of amnesia, and this happens. These amnesiac elderly people who die either half, you know, in comas, dementia. I mean, she had clouds of them around her. She was a helper almost all of her life in convalescence. So no wonder why, you know, when she first came into me, she's like, I don't even know whose life I'm living. I know when I was sitting there looking at her like, I know why. You know, because you've got too many trying to live that one life.
Just get back to that same point with the last one I was mentioning, you know, when we looked at the nodes and it's a square to Saturn. So you're talking about you know, integrating through the North Node to
From
heal.
Saturn, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, is that? I was just trying to understand that formula, right? I mean, it's like that you would go into the.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain that a little bit?
This skip step goes to that node. This skip step goes to that node.
Okay.
Again, it's simple. Just stand on the node,
Yeah.
look to the center of the chart, and it's the node to the left.
Okay, so basically, but I mean, in terms of how you would. If you weren't doing DMP and you're looking at another way to heal this, what would that be? Like if for the Saturn piece, applying to the North Node.
Saturn applying to the North Node.
How's the North Node in Libra the resolution? Like,
To the Saturn. You know, I don't know enough. I mean, this was a one-off session. Maybe that's why we did so many layers, because however it was set up, she was only going to see me once. But I would say from what I revealed to what her psyche revealed, and if I look at this is certainly a relationship to oneself, okay, that needs to be revisited. And this does have to do with her value and her worth, right? That then would allow her to relate to others in a different way. I mean, this one's pretty clear, and I think that's the one that would show the most, is that she needed to revisit that anger and that rage and all that stuff and kind of clear out that karmic closet to be able to reintegrate it in a healthy way, right? So that she then would get to the empowered layer of this, which is I have the right to stand up for my own emotional reality, right? Okay. Okay, so Mark and I were laughing about this on the break, where he was saying he put up his chart and Kim Marie said she had hers. Well, when I was preparing my stuff for this segment, I was going, you know, I'm an Aquarius South Node in the 11th house. I should probably put up my chart and blah, blah. So anyway, here it is. So all three of us decided to expose ourselves today. Yeah, I know. There was no collaboration on this. Okay. So, you know, I've really got a double signature, and I have to tell you a funny story, because Aquarius is, as I was saying, part of the Aquarian lesson outside of, or the Aquarian energy outside of the fragmentation and trauma and all that stuff that we were just talking about. You know, part of the resolution, I didn't talk about the natural resolution as to Leo as the polarity point to that. Leo is an integrating factor, right? The sun is an integrating factor within our psyche because, as we know, the sun is the center of the solar system, right? It's what holds it together. Things revolve around the sun. So when you think of, these fragmented parts, they need to come back into some kind of wholeness. It's the same when I see Piscean dissociation and Virgo as the resolution to that. I think of the myth of Isis, because she is the one who, and she's associated with Virgo, by the way. She remembers, brings back together the dissociated pieces of Osiris. So this is a kind of synthesizing, putting together energy that pulls back those, out there pieces, right? Isis she's also an integrating factor. So, opposite to all of these, you have an integrating factor, and that's part of the antidote. So, one of my stories, the funny thing, just recently when I was in Bimini, I've always had a strong memory of connection with Lemuria, which comes up for me in the Yucatan. And it's not a pleasant memory. Every time I go to the Yucatan, I have a wonderful time, except that I always need to take time to grieve. And sometimes I just have to stay in my room for one day and cry and cry and cry. So there's these very deep memories coming up for me down there. And eventually, it took me about 5 years to get to the story, but it was a Lemurian connection, and it was kind of the loss of that civilization and some of the ones that got to the Yucatan. And it's actually unclear to me if I was even in spirit form or made it there in body form, but a part of me was sitting in a cave just grieving the loss of my civilization or whatever, my people. And that was part of what the resonance was. Anyway, I go to Bimini, and it's got this connection with Atlantis, and I got this double signature, and I'm like, I must have some Atlantean thing, although I've never really connected with that. And don't mean to trigger you, Naomi, because she's got her own Atlantean memory, which was, you have an Aquarius South Node too, right? Was that the signature? She's dissociated at the moment. Never mind. Oh, you're Naomi. I'm sorry. Oh, that's why she's looking at me. I'm sorry. I was dissociated. Is yours Aquarius South Node? Is that what you said?
I'm sorry, I'm associated. Sag in the 10th.
What's the Aquarius signature in your axis?
The Aquarius signature.
Or Uranus?
Uranus in the 10th.
How does it tie into the karmic axis? It doesn't?
I can't picture
sorry.
it right
All
now.
right, I'm sorry. It's just that she talked to me on the side about that. Okay.
Like, but,
all right, anyway, she was telling me about her Atlantean memory.
In the Aries house, Taurus, Gemini.
Yeah, because it's a Pisces ascendant chart.
Yeah.
Either Pisces or Aries ascendant charts are always going to have natural houses. Yeah, I know. Well, this is what I want to get to. The funny thing is, this Bimini memory. So I go and I snorkel Bimini Road, and I'm asking, whatever memory wants to come to me. I'd like to find out what my connection was with Atlantis. So later that day, I go down to the ocean, and I'm sitting there at night, and I asked for somebody to come and kind of show. So this kind of Atlantean priest rises, this is my own imagery. Atlantean priest kind of rises up out of the ocean, and I think, oh, he must be the one that's going to tell me what's going on. And this was so interesting. From behind him came these native people, and they said to me, Taino. And in my Pat consciousness, I know that Taino is a tribe in Cuba. Later, when I resourced it and researched it further, because I didn't know a lot about them, they were through the whole Caribbean. I didn't know this, and they're considered to be very ancient people. Again, I didn't know this. So these Taino people come forward, and they're like, you were one of us. And then they start showing me these stories of how even in Atlantean times, there were native people. I had no idea about any of this. And they were outside of the society. They weren't marginalized like they were in our society, but they were also outside kind of going, dudes, like, look at what you're doing. And they were like, they weren't listening to us then either. So talk about the double not belonging, right? So it's like you're not even integrated in Atlantean society, but like even being an outcast in an outcast society, right? And I was like, oh my God, what an Aquarius self-known. So anyway, one of my stories is about being cast out from a tribe. And it's, you know, and again, that is a bit of a double signature, because tribal, we often think of tribe as the safest place to be, right? Well, I was cast out of a tribe. And I was cast out of a tribe because, and it's a real story of individuation. I didn't, growing up, I didn't really know, everybody knew what they wanted to be. Some were canoe makers, they were all doing their thing, and I had like, couldn't find my special skill, my Leo North Node. I couldn't find my special talent. And I had a lot of anxiety about it because I'm a Pluto Virgo in the 6th house. And so I couldn't find this thing. And I had a sibling, and my sibling, you know, was an accomplished warrior, and he had all of these, like, you know, arrows and knives and all these things that represented his warriorship. And I was kind of compulsively, like, you know, there was jealousy of the sibling, but there was this kind of like he had these symbols of power. And I kind of got attached to a symbol of power, and I stole this knife. And it's like I went out into the forest with it. And it was almost like I just kind of viscerally wanted to get what power it was that he got from that, because I was still searching for it in myself. You know, I was searching for what is my thing. And so I stole this knife, and the tribe found out, and they outcast me. But the thing was, it wasn't clear to me in the regression if the tribe was like just doing that as a punishment or if it was permanent. But basically, they packed up a canoe with supplies and just did this banishment like this. Just no words, nothing. Just silent back turned, and like the canoe was there. Well, the interesting is when I initially dropped into the story, the first memory was of being in the canoe, and I'm in the swamps, and I'm laying in the bottom of this canoe, and I'm grieving, and I'm grieving, and I'm grieving, Saturn conjunct the South Node, and I'm saying, I can't go forward and I can't go back. That was my first memory. And that was the frozen trauma. That's Uranus, frozen trauma. And I'm literally like frozen in this canoe. And I'm like, whoever was working with me, it like took them forever to get me to move forward in the story, because I just laid there and grieved. I don't even know who I am yet. It's the very first scene. And I'm just laying there grieving and grieving, going, I can't go forward, I can't go back, I can't go forward, I can't go back. It was that frozen nature of Uranus, Aquarius. So then we did finally go back and found out, okay, so I got outcast. So then I'm this native person out in the swamps, and I'm not a really good hunter. I can forage. And I'm just grieving the loss of my people. And I start to have all these fantasies about what I can do to get back to the tribe. And I fantasize killing panthers or crocodiles and coming, again, I'm like trying to actualize my North Node, right? I'm trying to think of what's this really great thing I could be glorious in and they'll accept me, right? And the interesting thing was, in typical Aquarian fashion, I'm just imagining it. I'm not actually doing anything about it, right? I'm just kind of dreaming up all these things, right? Because I'm so stuck in the grief. The grief absolutely paralyzed me in that life. It was just paralyzing, Saturn conjunct the South, paralyzing grief. And so I'm grieving, and I'm thinking, well, I could kill it and come back with the skins, and then they'll love me, and all the Leo things. I never did anything. There was also, at the time, there were settlers and other colonial, and I I never interacted with them. I just stayed on the outside and observed. I'd kind of look at them fascinated, but there was no contact. Eventually, because I wasn't a really good hunter, whatever, I foraged, I grieved, I just gave up. I mean, Piscean give up, Saturn hopelessness, and I croaked. Because again, that's what we do in our past lives. Eventually you die. And when I died, I really died in this state of aloneness. And even though the tribe people came to me in the spirit world, I didn't want to see them. I was so crushed. And God bless the person who was working with me, because they took them so long for me to even listen to what these people had to say, and all these animals had to come in and help. It's a big, long story I won't get into. But the interesting thing was, when I finally was able to, there was shame also, so when I was finally able to face the tribe, and I looked, the two people that were my parents came forward in my current life parent form. And I went, because I was adopted in this life. And they were my adoptive parents. And the first thing, they came forward and they said, we outcast you in that life, and we made a promise to you that we would never do it again. And I mean, I just was totally shocked. Of course, grieving, crying. Of course, this time it's tears of joy and just, wow, you know, I mean, I really had no concept. But I realized, man, I tested them in this life, you know. I mean, I really tested that promise because I was a little hellion as a kid. So I put them through their paces. And so that, of course, was obviously a very big healing for me on many levels. Again, bringing into the point of what is the Leo polarity to those alienation, belonging through the heart, right? And that regression was so healing to me because I always had that sense of alienation in my family. Obviously, the abandonment and adoption issues are a longer standing karmic pattern for me. I've had to work through lots of layers of that, and it goes on. But that one regression really just opened up my whole, it's like to really be able to feel the love that they had to give me, the parts of me that had blocked that. Saturn opposing that Leo, right? We were talking about that with Michelle's, and the last Capricorn case that I put up in Capricorn, the boundaries that we put around us, the unnecessary boundaries. Yes? For those of us that live in the Pacific Northwest, will you be able to do regressions? That's right, you said you were going to mention that I was going to come to, I'm speaking at the Seattle's Washington Astrological Society for a weekend in November. I think it's the second weekend in November. And I'm going to find a place to stay and see clients also, so I'll be able to do regressions in Seattle when I'm there. And you guys will get an email because Kim Marie said she'll share all the emails. And she's like, wait, I had more questions.
Well, on that note, I was talking to Patricia about me becoming a Boulder and doing her 2-year training. And so if people are interested, find me on Facebook or send me an email because I would love to get a group together and make that happen here.
Okay, I don't want to jump to that kind of business side of that until we're done here. Where am I on time? Oh my God, Pisces, we never got to Pisces. Poor little Pisces always gets left out. All right, so I'm going to have to do Pisces rather quickly, but as I understand, Kim Marie very eloquently covered it this morning, so maybe she's covered my butt already without knowing it. So somebody said that that was the best Pisces talk that they've heard in a long time. Great. Okay, so Pisces. As I was saying before, there's that element of dissociation that happens in Pisces. As we know in the natural archetype, it's associated with mysticism and transcendence and so on and so forth. When you come into it from the past life perspective, that can be checking out. I mean, again, Pisces with Virgo as the polarity to it also is what I find a lot with Pisces signatures in past life, again, karmic signatures, they have less of a karma of commission and more of a karma of omission, meaning the things they didn't do, right? So it's not necessarily the Piscean karma often, and again, you can't generalize anything, but quite frequently are the things they didn't do, the things they didn't show up for, the things they checked out on. And in this lifetime, the universe pushes the envelope with them, basically saying, Virgo, show up front and center, clear-eyed, be here, right? That's Virgo. So Virgo challenges that Piscean side, and that's what the growth is. It's like, show up. And so sometimes, when there's I call it the karma of omission. It's the things you didn't do, right? It's the places you checked out that will be challenged in this lifetime and basically say, show up. So that's just one level of it. Yeah, you know, I see a lot of surrender and give up is another level. That's also part of checking out. Naivete is often a wound that's in the Piscean karma. You know, just like it is, there's a little bit of that misplaced trust in Sagittarius. Pisces, it's often naivete, that's in this case. Sorry? Poisoning in Pisces? I find that more in Scorpio, but it certainly could be possible because Pisces is that kind of boundarylessness, you know? So it's that openness to invasion. That's where you get a lot, that's where I was saying I get a lot of the spirit attachment stuff comes into that Neptunian boundary. You know, again, when you've checked out, somebody else checked in, possibly. It happens. So this woman, I'm going to try to go through her story quickly. It's pretty obvious what the Pisces. Can anybody pick out the Piscean signature? So we've got this crossing the 9th and 8th house, so it's going to bring in kind of Sagittarian, Scorpionic themes in the past combined with Pisces. Pluto's in Virgo in the 2nd with its polarity point, meaning its evolution is going towards Pisces. And then we have this square to the nodes over here, more of the Capricorn grief and Virgo guilt stuff. So, and a little bit of savior karma here, right? You got the double savior karma signature because you've got Pisces and the Sag thing going on. So basically, again, I've got a few stories. Let me see how many of them I can get out. Holocaust life was one of them. And before she came for the session, she said, and you know, Pisces rules the pineal gland, the dreaming state, right? The in-between the world state. And she said a few weeks before she did the session, she said, what's been happening to me for a few weeks since I knew I was coming for the session, she said, every time I'm falling asleep, it's like something jolts me awake. And she noticed it. And she said, it sounds like a pop or something. Well, that actually, the reason why I'm bringing it up is because it became a little important point in the story. She went back into a Holocaust life, and when we went into the life, she was already well shut down, just in give up. But there was this promise of freedom because it was kind of at the end of the war, and there were rumors that some of the camps might be liberated, and you know, maybe there was freedom coming, and the South Node's in the 9th house, right? So maybe there's some freedom coming. There's a hope of freedom. Unfortunately, that didn't happen to them, and she went into the gas chamber. So it was kind of in this shutdown, like, you know, I don't need to really draw the picture for you. And right in the moment before they turned on the gas, there were gunshots outside, and that's what snapped her too. Because, again, she had been in a state of hopelessness, dissociation, shutdown, and she heard the gunshot before they turned on the gas, and all of a sudden it was like the realization of I'm about to die came into her consciousness, but more than that, all of a sudden she realized that she used to have children, and that she couldn't believe that she forgot about them. And it was like this kind of like gasping of coming into awareness of, how could I have forgotten them? And that was her dying thought, because then the gas came on. And so it was like, you know, I don't even know if I can describe it enough, but the signatures are so clear to me. You know, that moment, like, you know, snapped her too. And she had so lost herself, so Piscean, been in the fog, so dissociated, so that, you know, she lost everything about herself. And in that moment, snapped to and realized, oh my God, I had children and I forgot, how could I have forgotten them? Well, when we went earlier in the story, we found out that she did have children when she came to the camp, but they were taken from her. We also found out that earlier, in her earlier days when she arrived at the camp, she was a source of enthusiasm and inspiration for other people, right? And that's what kept her going. It was this kind of service. And this 9th house, on the 9th house and the Pisces and the Virgo, that was what kept her going. But little by little, of course, as you can imagine, all of that was slowly eroded away till she became that shell of a person that died. So the interesting, when we went into the spirit world, her very much in the Piscean, self-sacrifice mode. She cared less about herself and was more interested in, obviously, the children and then helping everybody else in the camp, because that's that kind of Pisces in overdrive. So we worked with these different spirits that were around, et cetera, the children. Now here's an interesting resonance that comes up into her own current life, birth, womb stuff that we were talking about before when we talked about Cancer. She died in that state of give up and hopelessness. In her current life, in her womb memory, her mother was drugged. I mean, can you see this? Right? The moon's in Pisces in the 8th house. Her mother was drugged or passed out. She wasn't sure. She went through the memory and then correlated it with her mother. And clearly her mother was not there when she was giving birth, because as an infant in the womb coming out, she felt the contraction stop. And as her consciousness went through that memory, everything went through her mind. I'm not going to survive, 2nd house. I've got to fight to live, right? The Mars. She's abandoned me. She's not here. I'm going to die. All of those things came through. And what was so interesting to me about that was that it was almost like her soul was already starting to try to reverse that pattern right from the moment of birth in her own womb, about making her show up and fight, right? Making her show up. Now, she did have another life where she committed suicide, which is obviously another way of checking out, right? And so in her own womb, Mother was not only mirroring her own complex that she died with the guilt of not being there for her own children. Mother wasn't there in her womb. A mirror of her own complex, right? And then at the same time, the soul is like saying, we're going to reverse this pattern in this lifetime. And so she was aware of kind of feeling like, and I'm not saying that it actually happened that way, but her consciousness as this infant was kind of feeling like, I've got to actively get myself out of here or I'm not going to survive. So it was almost like saying, show us you really want to live, right? It was a reversing of all of that hopelessness and the cloud of dissociation that she died in the past. And in another past life, I don't know, do I have time for that? 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Yes? Lourdes is going, yes, do it. This is the other past life where she committed suicide, which gets into then other layers of the Piscean archetype and past life experiences. She was, as I mentioned before, Virgo, Pisces, healers, natural healers, herbalists. She was born into a kind of gypsy pagan culture. I don't remember where it was, but lovely family. She had a great dad. Her dad was her mentor. He had a role within the community. They did ritual magic for the community, not the bad stuff, the good stuff. So they held a place of some kind of spiritual authorities within their community. She, as the daughter, was apprenticing with the father. They had a lovely relationship. Everything is fine. Happy little pagan herbalists. And then this young man joins the community, and she falls in love with him. They don't know this young man. He's from outside. The father starts to befriend him. Everything seems fine. But and again, she's in her naivete. This is a kind of naivete and betrayal story. She had feelings that something's not right? This is where we get those kind of Sagittarian, because this is a 9th house. Remember, we were talking about in Sag, wounds to the intuition when we don't trust it. So she didn't trust. She had feelings things weren't right, but then her head is telling her something else, and her heart's telling her, I love him, and blah, blah. So they end up getting married. Well, the reality was this young man wanted the father's position. And as he was learning more from the father, who took him also as an apprentice, he wanted the whole kit and caboodle. He wanted to be that authority within the community that father had. So he was slowly poisoning the parents. So she didn't know this. So she's the herbalist, and she's like scrambling because the parents are progressively getting sicker and sicker. So she's moved out and she's living with the husband. And it was like her whole life is like, at this moment, she's frenzied, kind of running back and forth and trying to be the wife and cover the father's responsibilities in the community and try to help the parents. So the young man starts saying, oh, well, I'll take care of dad's responsibilities. Don't worry about that. Right? So, you know, he's already slipping into dad's position. And meanwhile, the parents are being slowly poisoned. And one day when she goes over to their house, they're both dead. She gets the intuitive hit right then. Right? Oh, my God. They've been poisoned and it's my husband. Right? And that was that kind of that's all that huge betrayal. Right? The scorpionic huge betrayal. And then, of course, the guilt kicks in because I felt it, I didn't trust it, I should have known, and she really did love her parents and they were lovely. And so this all starts eating her apart. She does not have the power to confront him. So this is, again, a little powerlessness and that Piscean, you know. She just doesn't know. So she kind of, you know, lives with him for a while. She can't take it. She commits suicide. She poisons herself, and she's out of there. Again, that Piscean. So that was the story where she committed the suicide. The healing and resolution of that had a lot to do with, you know, reinvigorating this reconnecting her with that intuitive self that did know. And yeah, she had a lot of guilt about, and she was saying, I felt it. You know how many times we do that, right? Oh, I felt I should have, you know, but I didn't trust that. So, you know, this has an interesting signature as far as people were talking. I don't know if you minds can absorb this because I don't know if I can barely get it out. It's a complex signature. She's got Virgo moving towards Pisces, and she's got Pisces moving towards Virgo, right, as a karmic evolutionary signature. So, in deciphering this, I'll just put it into context for you. In her current life, she's a counselor. And she also has no boundaries, or at least she didn't used to. She had very poor boundaries. She worked with a lot of borderline clients. It was a lot of enmeshment with her clients. So the first thing she needed to do, and these stories all helped in the result of this, her only value she saw of herself from the Holocaust woman and as the healer woman was as some healer helper. So the first thing she needed to do was to re-identify herself, what she valued. That her only value, Pluto in the second house, wasn't just as a server, Virgo, right? And the moving to the polarity point of that for this Pluto is to move into that Piscean kind of, you know, you gotta surrender control. If you're helping or serving, whatever, it's not about you, right? It's not about how well you do or none of that, because it's not about you. If you're in any service capacity, it's not about you. It's about what's happening. It's the process. So part of that was this ability to surrender that, right? And to surrender control of the outcome of what she was doing, and that she wasn't just valuing herself as a helper and forming those kinds of relationships, right? On the other side here, she needed to rekindle, this is a double kind of wounded trust thing. I forgot to mention one of the huge imprints from the Holocaust woman was she had lost her faith in God. Huge. And that took a long time to work with in the Bardo. Right, about how to reconcile such a horrible life and a loss of faith. But that's a double signature of that, right? Loss of faith. She's also got this Jupiter square the nodes, loss of faith. So in working with that, that's this signature. This needed to be empowered, right? So that then she could move into this third house capacity where she would be able to interact with others from her own truth, right, from her own knowing, many others, right, third house, kind of diversity of people, with boundaries, with discernment, because that last story was a lesson in discernment, which is very key in the Virgo-Pisces axis, the learning of discernment. Where the boundaries have been unclear, right, you can't discern. So it's the necessary need to establish healthy boundaries.
Node in Pisces in the 9, I feel this need to sacrifice also.
Yes.
And how you said at the beginning she had no boundaries,
Yeah.
of course, but one of her lessons is that she doesn't have to sacrifice herself.
That was the point, exactly. That's what I was saying about the establishing of boundaries. And her practice changed after working with this. She had all of these clients that she was like, I don't want to get into it, but borderline is a very difficult, anybody who's, she's shaking her head, so I don't need, anybody who's a professional mental health counselor, borderline is almost like the bane of their existence. It's very difficult to deal with. And she was sapped. I mean, she had like her whole caseload was that. So here, again, and she started to pull back those boundaries, and she said, as she started to establish, she didn't need to totally sacrifice herself anymore. And she said, my practice started to change. I was drawing more people to me that really wanted to do the work, that were really showing up for their process. Oops, mirror. Right? Can you see the mirroring there? So that's what I mean about this kind of coming out of that Pisces into this Virgo, is like that boundary. Yes, she was still meant to kind of be interacting and, with the diversity of people, but not without the Virgonian discernment and boundary. She needed to have that.
Learning how to say no.
Very good. Absolutely. Learning how to say no, that's a boundary.
It's such a charged chart. I mean, I feel it really intensely, and it's
Really?
Piscean energy also, but...
What's charged about it for you?
I don't know. I mean, it's just like, yeah.
The sacrifice part, yeah. Well, that had become a karmic addiction to her, right? And again, there's also the savior, the hero level of the Sag that I was talking about. She's got a double signature of that. So yeah, it had become a huge. It's like a karmic addiction, being the hero, being the savior. Not anymore. Or at least less so, let's put it that way. Certainly she's on her road to evolution. Okay, I think we are wrapping up. Oh, one more question.
Yeah, it's just more technical. When you're doing these, you can't plan an hour for a chart reading or something like that. I mean, how long do these sessions take with someone? Do you...
When I do regressions, usually first sessions can be 2 to 3, subsequent sessions are 2 hours. Okay. Oh, yeah? Sessions, 200 to 250, depending on if it goes into the 3-hour range. Yeah. So, like Kim Marie said, she's going to share emails. We'll be able to, I'm going to be working on my next year's schedule. I will be in Seattle, and I will definitely be trying to set up places to work so I can see Seattle people